Hello and welcome to another episode of Tradecraft Tuesday, where we break down attacker techniques, TTPs, and try to explain how they're relevant and how you can defend from them.
So this episode, just like previous episodes, once again, is once a month. And the whole goal of it is we realize that whether it's support conversations, just a casual like trade show conversation, or folks hitting us up on chat on saying, I've got a situation, maybe it's a line of business application that needs to have admin rights, or maybe it's the exact opposite. It's a technician saying, I'm trying to convince my boss we don't need to make exceptions for admin users. What can you give for me? And I think the easiest thing that we realized was there was a giant gap in that need. So we're going to break down a little bit of news from the last month, but this whole episode is going to be all about how can hackers exploit this in real time, doing some live demonstration, pulling up some real novel security research you probably haven't seen before, and really diving into why that security boundary is so important to delineate between users that have no privileges and admin users who have more or less the keys to the castle or that local castle.
Right.
So without further ado, somebody want to take the news?
All right, let's get into the news. So since the last Tradecraft Tuesday we did a month ago, some of this, for some of you who really keep up on the security stuff, might seem like old hat, might seem like we're bringing up stuff, that happened forever ago. Really, the whole point of this is we try to pull out interesting bits from the news that, we can kind of build around a theme, or that we can give some additional insight into to say, hey, here's why this is important, here's why this matters, what can you do with it? So the very first one we're going to start off with is a blog post by Tavis Ormandy from Google Project Zero, in which he describes a flaw in the Windows message passing system that basically allows unprivileged Windows to send all kinds of messages to higher privileged Windows. So what you can think about here is maybe I'm doing some work, I've opened a window that's an administrative command prompt, I need to be able to do things as an admin, but I also have lower level windows, like maybe my Slack or something else, right? If somebody compromises one of those lower level windows, they can send messages to my administrative command prompt and execute code as an administrator. So this might seem like, oh, that's weird, that never happens. Well, actually, if you're a user of Chrome, you have this situation every day where every one of your Chrome tabs actually runs as a low privileged process. And whenever it needs to do things like read files or save files or print, it has to communicate with its parent process to allow it to do that. And so there's that normal thing there where you can communicate between them, but everybody kind of just assumed that there had to be some sort of existing relationship, whereas Tavis pretty much displayed to everybody that, no, you could send any messages to any window ever, and this bug has existed for 20 plus years. So, that was pretty interesting. Definitely think about this kind of stuff when, like I said, when you have an administrative command prompt open. Maybe don't leave it open all the time. Open it, do your stuff, close it.
It's funny, these old legacies Chris mentioned, old school functionality, not even so much a bug, more like a architecture design flaw that Tavis helped uncover that's been there forever. And I think you'll notice that the recurring theme of security is perfect prevention isn't possible. Minimize your attack surface. So little things as simple as I'm leaving a command prompt that's elevated open. There could be some additional attack surface. Obviously, these started getting more extreme, but that's part of the reason that we're bringing it up here, with the theme being security boundaries and how to abuse them. This one was kind of a perfect way to kick off the show, and it's less than a month old. So we've already posted a link. Obviously, there'll be a link included in the description of this video. But I think, that's a good way to start thing. Followed up by last month, right? We were talking more about the remnants of Bluekeep. It looks like, for those that aren't following, right, Bluekeep was that remote exploit for several versions of remote desktop protocol. And things have kind of only got a little bit more hairy, right?
Yep.
So, one of the things that we noticed that was brought up here was, since our last episode was remote code execution vulnerabilities, very similar to Bluekeep, have also been patched, and it was unearthed during Microsoft's process, from what I understand of, while they were doing R&D, while they were working with it, while other security researchers were also poking the attack surface of remote desktop. they discovered some of these new vulnerabilities, and I think it even included Server 2012 R2 for sure,
Yep.
and Windows 10. I don't recall 16 or not, but that's another one of those.
Yeah, I pulled these versions directly from the MSRC blog, and they did not suggest 2016, so that could be, it may not be vulnerable. But these are pretty devastating. And this is a thing that happens a lot, right? Somebody comes out, publishes a bug in an attack surface that maybe hasn't been looked at in a long time, or really maybe has never been looked at a lot, and the crowd just kind of jumps on it. Everybody starts taking a look, trying to find other bugs there. And this is a result of that same type of thing. And one of the reasons why these are so bad is these are very easily wormable vulnerabilities. So you can attack one computer and turn that computer to start attacking every other computer, and next thing you know, the whole internet is attacking each other. And so, Microsoft says go out, patch these as soon as you can. And, we found people even still today who are still vulnerable to Bluekeep. A lot of people have open RDP to the internet, maybe because they have small install bases. They don't want to put a whole VPN in front of it, but they still want to be able to remote in and do things. We recommend that you do not expose RDP to the internet because that opens up a whole new attack surface as far as brute forcing credentials and just remote code execution vulnerabilities like this. But if you've got to do it, at least go patch.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the lessons learned from last Friday. The giant attack that hit a lot of the Texas, schools and information system. What was it called? The Texas Information Resources Department, DIR. One of the CISO's lessons learned was please, we learned the hard way, don't keep RDP open. Followed by several other things about accessing certain websites, privilege separation, segmentation. So once again, all these things kind of rolling into each other.
Yep.
Once again, this also segues to another thing hitting our community, which is that digital dental record in the, PercySoft, right?
Yep.
So this is another one of our channel, software at the end of the day. It's supposed to be protecting dental records. There's been a lot of conversation on this. The long story short, for those that aren't familiar, was once again, this is supply chain attack. Somebody looked at a vendor like PercySoft or the digital dental record software and said, you know what? If I could get in here and if I could get administrative access, I might be able to abuse that administrative access to pivot to other things. So some of those other things in this example was ConnectWise control was abused in this case, using some of the features that instead of like when we looked at some of the breaches, several months ago, and we saw the actual attackers using the remote access tool to be able to click and install ransomware. That's largely changed in just a couple months. We've seen the hackers get better using the actual control software's ability to kick off commands. Also using, what was that called, John? The backstage capability. So that's the capability of Screen Connect to, even when a user's locked their machine, being able to still have access to a privileged command prompt and PowerShell instance. So all these things, once again, you'll notice that the theme is knowing thyself, minimizing your security baseline. And I think that's maybe the perfect time to talk about this could happen to any of us, right? And maybe the biggest headline in regards to public compromise outside of breaches. How about that Twitter CEO?
Yeah. So Jack Dorsey's Twitter account got taken over, and whoever the attackers were, they used his account to post a bunch of racist tweets and retweet a bunch of racist Nazi propaganda. It only lasted a few hours, or maybe not even an hour, before Twitter took it down and they reclaimed the account. But they basically came out and said, hey, the reason this happened was because of a SIM swapping attack. For anybody not familiar, SIM swapping is basically what happens when your telephone carrier, whether that's AT&T, Verizon, Sprint, T-Mobile, whoever it is, each of the SIM cards that's in your phone is attached to a phone number in their system. If you lose your phone and you lose that SIM card, they give you a new phone, a new SIM card, and they just redirect and say, oh, this phone number is now attached to this new SIM card. That's supposed to require that you do it. But what attackers have figured out is that they can call up or talk to their buddy or somebody they know, pay somebody off who's at one of these telecom carriers and say, hey, I want you to switch this phone number over to this phone that I can control So now they go try to log in as Jack Dorsey. It says, oh, hey, we're going to send you a two-factor SMS to your phone. Instead of Jack Dorsey's phone, it goes to the attacker's phone. And now the attacker can log in and is bypassed 2FA. So this is not a super common attack, okay? For the most part, attackers are not going to be using this type of attack to go after just anybody. They're going to go after more high-profile people, CEOs of companies, potentially like CFOs of companies, other people who have interesting access that's going to allow them to turn it into money or, you know, some really valuable account compromise. But that doesn't mean that we should just ignore this and say this is not a legitimate thing. This means we need to move away from two-factor over SMS, right? Move to something like a TOTP, time-based tokens through Google Authenticator, or a third-party service, something like an Authy or a Duo. These allow you to remove that trust from just saying, hey, is this phone number associated, and kind of choose where you put that trust.
Yeah, so for the IT departments out there looking for that, just a little trinket to sprinkle on like a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday out to your customers or out to your boss in the IT department, like these are the real world attacks that help you justify better infrastructure that also provides like better user experience too. Like no offense, the SMS, my mom hates them. At the end of the day, I guess her iPhone has made it a little bit easier to autofill some of those, but these are great examples to be able to use offensive security to help justify either both spend and a good example of what you're minimizing risk against. Then again, there's only so much budget at the end of the day. So I think that's enough of news. I always love to jump into it, but I'm really here for the fun stuff, which this month is all about breaking things. With that said, I mean, what's probably the number one, I won't even say support ticket. I think usually it's about antivirus that we get a lot of questions about.
Yep.
If I'm running antivirus, how come my user who has admin privileges can uninstall the antivirus? We get that one a lot at Huntress, and that's from both customers, junior technicians. I'm sure some of you guys and gals out there are like, how could this be a question in 2019? But it is, right? It shows that there's all kinds of levels of expertise. And maybe the way that I wanted to start this out is to frame the question, right? We're talking about what's typically referred to as anti-tamper mechanisms. And these are mechanisms that prevent your antivirus from being uninstalled or disabled, or ideally not allowing a file to be restored out of the, quarantine. But the reality is most antivirus companies, if not all, have established a security baseline similar to Microsoft. So in case that word security baseline is unfamiliar to you, it typically refers to this is the level of defense we're going to put in place, which means we are going to service. Meaning if there is a vulnerability or somebody can do this as an unprivileged user, we're going to patch it immediately in the ideal circumstance. However, sometimes these anti-tampering mechanisms actually fall outside of that security baseline. They're like a good enough attempt. So a good example of this is, John, when you were a sysadmin, I mean, did you have any managed AV or anything like that you were controlling? A Semantic or McAfee that required maybe a password or something for users to uninstall?
No, not at the time. This was early 2000s.
So I think like 2005, I remember my first time coming across a Semantic endpoint protection server. And right, it would come up with that lovely pop-up that when my user tried to uninstall, it would say, please enter your password. And I'm sure sysadmins are head nodding like, yeah, I've seen those. Sometimes we forget that those mechanisms really are, not as tamper-proof as we'd like to think. Right. And rather than, bad-mouthing or even something along those lines, we're all about educating here on this end. So if you give me a second, I wanted to share some research. Chris, while I'm sharing some research, you want to talk a little bit about, what these mechanisms are, how, like as a software dev, how these are often implemented in some ways that people can get around?
Sure. Yeah, so a lot of times these are implemented very simply to just say, oh, the user has to have administrative rights, either to read or write a file, something like that. As they try to become more and more sophisticated, they'll look at doing things with drivers. So they'll say, oh, we have a driver now. The driver can control access to files. It can control whether or not you can remove a service, things like that. And it's kind of an escalating scale of, what type of things they want to do. But it's always a, give one, take one type of thing where we have to come to a balance and say, at the end of the day, it has to be able to be uninstalled, right? Because what if I no longer want that product? I need to be able to uninstall it. If I can't uninstall it, all the users are going to go to Reddit and they're going to complain, and it's going to be a big thing. But we have to make it a little bit harder to uninstall, so an average user can't do it, or really terrible malware can't just jump on and remove my antivirus, and then I'm SOL. So there's a balance that they have to make, and there's a bunch of trade-offs there, and so it really kind of depends. But if you're really interested in the technical details, there's a lot of research out there. People reverse engineering these mechanisms to say, here's how it works, here's what they did, here's ways to bypass it, and that's kind of some of the stuff that Kyle is showing here.
Okay, so one of the things that it's a 2017 document. I thought it was really novel at the time. 2019, it's still novel. And this is from the team at Fortinet, and their whole idea behind this was, let's assess what are even the existing self-defense or anti-tampering mechanisms that are available, and what can we do? So notice they've even defined what self-defense is here, that they're saying it's a security feature that should prevent the unattended modification, right? So that could be the uninstallation, disabling antivirus. And notice here, administrator with administrative right is not a security boundary. And they even call it out in 2017 that this was a great debate. The difference is reality now in 2019, people are aware that administrative users will exist. You've got to do what you can to self-protect. But I really wanted to use this article to start highlighting on how some of the most common software gets abused. They actually found multiple exploits. Some of them are 0 days. Some of them are just abusing features. Like, for instance, if you're a managed service provider and you take over onboard a new company, and there's somebody's old managed antivirus product is installed on there, you need to get it off, right? So at the end of the day, to be able to remove that software, there sometimes needs to be a backdoor for you to be able to properly administer these computers. It's really no different than an IT team of an acquiring company. You acquire a new company and you have to undo some of their own security mechanisms. So what I want to do is highlight in here that notice that some of this stuff here is talking about how do we, break these as a user, not as an administrator. And Chris already mentioned that a lot of these self-protection mechanisms are introduced and implemented in the kernel as drivers or mini filters. And their goal is to be able to stop certain things from happening, right? Certain nefarious things from happening. As we go a little bit further in here, I want to actually, gloss over some of the high-level, more technical features here, but there's different ways to be able to abuse this software. Some of the times it's just as simple as deleting a file. Other times it's making a registry change. And sometimes it gets really low level, which means communicating to the actual antivirus product or driver itself, turning the antivirus on itself. So let's go take a look a little bit about how this looks like in real life. Right? So once again, they did no fuzzing, which is a technique that's used for, finding out bugs. This really was just auditing a handful of products. And right, there's no product that probably doesn't have this issue. It's a complex problem at the end of the day, more of a feature and not a legit security boundary is what we're trying to highlight. So if you are making the mistake, for instance, of allowing your users to run as privileged administrative users, you have to think what that allows them to do. And sometimes this case is good old-fashioned technique, which we'll discuss a little bit more in depth here in the next section, which is called image file execution options. That's going to involve killing processes and replacing processes. Other times it's much more simple. So if I go down just a little bit further to one of my favorite examples out of here was one about Malwarebytes. So notice here they actually talk about Malwarebytes had some unprotected registry keys that allowed them to either disable or replace processes. And we'll actually show that in action in just a little bit. With that said, there's all kinds of other techniques here. And Chris, this one's in regards to a driver. For instance, Malwarebytes system driver, its whole job is to be able to prevent files from being deleted, right? Protecting files at the same time. It needs to be able to securely delete files. So could you talk maybe a real quick at a high level, maybe how communication to a driver works, and then I'll actually share real quick of how this bypass works.
Sure. There's really kind of two ways that a driver like this is going to get triggered. One of them is when you actually try to delete, modify, create a file. Because it's a file system driver, The file system will then call into this driver and say, hey, some user is trying to take this action, and then the driver can they can take some action based on whether or not they want to allow that, right? If you're trying to delete one of the Malwarebytes executables, they can deny the action, in which case that will filter back down to the user, and it will say, hey, unable to delete the file, right? The other way to communicate with a driver like this are by what Kyle referred to earlier as called ioctls. These are ways that you can trigger functionality and pass messages from an application in user space, i.e. your desktop, to the kernel. And so you want to pass a message to tell the driver to monitor some other process, or allow you to delete a file, or uninstall itself, right? Those are all kinds of messages that you're going to pass from your application to the driver. So when you go into Malwarebytes and you click, go ahead and uninstall, or, restrict this file access or something like that, that application is going to send messages to the driver to tell it what to do. And that's kind of how the communication channel goes back and forth.
Okay, so with Chris, what he said in regards to communication, right? A high-level summary is that antivirus products tend to have a driver. And just like the driver, right, you can't allow anybody to talk to it, because if you allow anybody to talk to it, there's some danger that could happen. So let's dive into one of these common techniques that elevated users, or sometimes unelevated users, can use to get bypass or slip past some of these, for instance, these ACLs or these anti-tampering mechanisms.
ACLs being access control lists.
Okay, thank you for that. So one of these that they actually called out is Malwarebytes has a self-protection mechanism. So as you can see here, it has a self-protection mechanism, and it has an actual driver just like we discussed. And its whole driver is available, and it prevents people from just randomly connecting to that with the access control list. But one of the things that they cutely call out here in this actual example is being able to call some of the ioctls, or that interface Chris discussed. If you have an application that can just send an arbitrary terminate the antivirus and disable the antivirus, that's obviously a bad thing, so you protect who can call it. And so Malwarebytes actually implemented smartly a system that says, only I can execute this command, right? That's kind of like authentication, right? Mm-hmm. I authenticated John. Yes, John, you're good. You work at Huntress. You can do that thing. That's how Malwarebytes works, which is a great idea of great engineering. But notice that one of the techniques they called out here is great old school process hollowing. And we've previously talked about injection, which at a high level, what this means is you have a target process, which is, you could imagine in this example here, this would be a Malwarebytes application that's allowed to be able to call the ioctl. You take your malware, whether as an admin or an unprivileged admin, depending on how the system is set up, you inject your malware into the new target process, which you could imagine that's a bad day for everybody. But now you're running your payload as Malwarebytes. And if you can successfully get that injection, by the way, there's a whole MITRE's attack framework, has whole articles on how process hollowing works and all the different malware in case you're into this stuff and really want to dive deep. But the long story short is you become Malwarebytes' own executable here. And hence the reason, as an administrator, especially if you can inject into this privileged process, you're now able to send some of these ioctls to maybe even disable the antivirus itself or bypass. So great example, and there's dozens of these, right? Kaspersky has similar type of problems that you can load different payloads. But let's pull a step back real quick and talk about other mechanisms. I actually called out on here. I said, well, one of the coolest techniques that I'm aware of is just going through and disabling or deleting antivirus files sometimes, or deleting files that really matter. So as I was browsing for other common techniques, one of the things I stumbled across was Twitter. Twitter's a great resource where you can sometimes find a resource that tells you exactly how to do this. So for instance, if you're a user of Sophos, somebody actually tweeted, this is about a year ago, Sophos, to remove the antivirus from Mac OS and bypass the tampering mechanism, you simply need to be able to run a privileged command. So you have to be admin here. You have to kill the privileged process, which is Sophos, and then remove a file, which is this Sophos antivirus file out of the library directory. And then you can run the removal tool. And at that point, that's more than enough to be able to get, past this technique. And there's nothing that's overly, special about that example. This is vendors all over the place tend to have this, that if you're an admin, you can't do these. So another screen that I'm sharing here is Avast, right? Avast, we've all seen this before. And in case you've never seen this before, this is the type of screen you typically see. Even though you're an admin, you run into a please allow me to uninstall. Yes, you can uninstall if you provide me a password type experience.
Right.
Super common. And it asks you, do you want to continue? But what if you don't have the password once again, right? This user only has admin privileges. They just don't have the IT department's password. So once again, they actually go in here and show that instead of providing the protected Avast password, one of their techniques, and AVG has a very similar code base now that Avast and AVG have bought each other. And you see that the long story short is they come out and said, you know what? Within the Avast and AVG software, there's this encrypted file called asw.rsep.dat. And all you need to do is delete this file and the password lock is removed. And voila, you can delete it using these tools.
Oh boy.
And that's what it allows you to do it. So a great example of files. John, I know you've been overly quiet over there. And I know some of the things that we were talking about was, some of these things that you can bypass are as simple as changes to the registry. You want to talk a little bit, John, just a high level of like the difference between HKey current user and HKey local machine and how some of these settings apply, to the whole machine? Because that's going to allow me to tee up for this next part here.
You're going to do the IFO?
I think that's a good segue. I'm going to show one example of one last registry bypass, and then I'm going to bring up a VM. So I think that's a good place for it.
So Kyle mentioned the HKey current user, which is when you log into Windows, your profile is loaded. That is your registry hive. And the user-specific settings are stored in HKey current user / your SID, whatever your SID is. Then there's also HKey local machine, which is where the system-specific settings are stored. So depending on the setting, sometimes the user preferences override the system preferences for that particular user, or vice versa.
Right, and your user preferences are going to be in your user profile. So if you're a domain user and you go from one computer to another, you will bring your user preferences and user settings with you, but system settings might be different.
Your Roman profile, and that's stored in the ntUser.dat, which is in the local root of your profile. So mine would be C users John.
So bringing it back,
ntUser.dat.
bringing it back to the security boundary conversation. HKey current user. Users need the ability to set their little desktop to whatever, fancy color or pictures of cats or whatever it is. At the same time, they want to, customize their environment. However, you don't want a user being able to escape that HKey current user. But as an administrator, you say there's that line of business application that you just had to give them access to instead of replacing it. They now have the ability to modify HKey local machine. So if I go back here under our screen sharing setup and show why this is such a bad thing, here's two more cases where we're still talking about bypassing antivirus. And notice this whole thing was, how do I install Trend Micro client without a password? Keep in mind, this is exactly what hackers are going to want to do when they get in your network, is exactly what a privileged user could do to you as well. And notice they give you could follow all these handy techniques and you could run some of these commands that's built in or call Trend Micro support. Or since they're an admin, once again, they can write to HKey local machine, which this is the actual example here. Notice that they call out inside HKey local machine is the Trend Micro software, and they just happen to have a registry value called allow uninstall. All right, it's protected probably. Sometimes you have to boot into safe mode to be able to use these. But according to these articles, if you notice, they say nothing about jumping into safe mode. They just straight up say, as an administrative user, open registry editor as admin, navigate to HKey local machine, and change allow uninstall from 1, which means enable, to 0, right? Or vice versa, right? Change the value from 0 to a 1 to allow it to uninstall. And by the way, now you can uninstall this application. And there's multiple articles that highlight this. Notice this one actually has kind of a somber, sad version of it. Unfortunately, the Trend Micro tool doesn't always work. However, worry not. Go into your registry editor, go to that same key that we talked about before, allow, uninstall, and you're golden. So you can imagine how hackers start to use this.
But the interesting part is this is not an article written for hackers, right? This is not, hey, you're a hacker, here's how to get around stuff. This is like, hey, you're a regular system administrator and you're having problems uninstalling something, maybe because you don't have the password. Right? Maybe one of your users who has local administrative privileges installed this, they moved on. Now you're trying to remove it as the administrator, but you can't because you don't have the password, right? So there's goes back to the trade-offs again of like, you can't make it so something is completely unable to be uninstalled because then your only option there is to, re-image the system and start fresh, and maybe that's not a thing that you want to do. So there has to be some sort of trade-off. And the big problem here, to kind of give an overarching trend to this, is that you're asking a computer to secure itself from itself. Right? That's pretty much impossible. That would be equivalent to if we told prisoners, like, all right, put yourself in jail and just make sure that you don't leave the prison cell. We're not actually going to lock the door, but just don't leave.
Trust but verify. No, that doesn't work.
There's not even any verification. It's just trust. So that's some of the problem. A user actually asked one of our listeners, Lowell said, even if every single tamper-proof mechanism could be bypassed by a hacker, it still stops the majority of users and basic malware from doing it. And he goes on to ask, why is it that Huntress doesn't have any of these, any protections built in thus far?
No, that's a great question, right? We actually took a step back and said, what is our own internal security boundary as a company? And we decided that the idea of a wishy-washy, I feel good and I'm protected, is a bit of a, I don't know, almost like a security blanket, right? It makes you feel warm and fuzzy, but if it's not actually protecting you, it could deceive you.
A false sense of security.
Yeah, that's a real good, and that was hard, right? As a bunch of security engineers who both break stuff and secure stuff, it was a hard thing for us to take a step back and say, should we at least try to make it harder? Should we actually do this? In our research and our time as offensive security engineers, we haven't found a product that we couldn't neuter or bypass or get around. So, that was our own internal, right? Everything that we came up with to try to protect ourselves with ioctls and drivers and self-protection mechanisms, bogged down the system, increased the surface area for attack, right? If you think about that case of that Malwarebytes driver, sometimes I remember Kaspersky got compromised several years ago in the Dooku 2 attack, and the actual attackers used the Kaspersky anti-protection mechanism to make sure like things couldn't get deleted to protect the malware itself.
Yes.
Right. So, I'll pull that link up because I'm sure people would be interested in there. But yeah,
there's really two ways you can approach this question, right? Like, are you trying to protect it from being uninstalled or bypassed by hackers, or just your average Joe regular user? For us, we actually started getting a lot of requests from people who said, hey, my users are uninstalling this. And for us, that was a real head scratcher at first, because we thought, like, well, why are they randomly uninstalling Huntress? And who knows? Like, there could be any number of things. Maybe they think it's slowing down their system. On one end of the spectrum, on the other end of the spectrum, maybe it's like insider threat, right? Who knows? So I think what we probably could do is, if we approach the problem from the standpoint of like, don't allow users to remove it and just say like, oh, any attacker is going to be able to bypass it, we could probably add some simple mechanism where it's like, oh, you got to have this password or that or the other. And we probably should do that. But I think the bigger question is like, why do your users have administrative access to everything, as opposed to maybe giving them administrative access to write certain files or to run a specific application as an administrator or something like that. So there's again, everything in security is a trade-off. There's usability on the one hand and security on the other. Which do we want more of? If we want more security, we end up with less usability. We want more usability, we end up with less security. So it's something that we're looking into. I think it's something that we should probably add at least some sort of simple thing so users can't just go click, program files uninstall. But We've been busy focusing on a lot of other stuff that people will get to see here in a month or so.
Yep.
Yeah.
So
I was just going to say, I mean, if that user's an admin and they're compromised, they can do a lot worse than just uninstall Huntress.
yeah, you got bigger fish to fry. So I'm going to pivot real quick into image file execution options. And I know that's a mouthful. So we tend to call this IFEO. So real quick, going into some screen share action. For those who've never heard of it, IFEO is a feature that's existed in Windows forever. And what I mean by that is you can go, once again, I'm referencing MITRE's attack platform, or, and they actually call out that this is a real way to be able to make, somebody's code run at a different time. And it has a legitimate feature. What stinks about this is, notice people actually call out privilege escalation, persistence, evading defenses. We're going to show you actually shutting down, processes and how this feature works. So to understand how something can work maliciously, it's always nice to understand what was its real purpose for. John, Chris, and I were all software developers. And even though we've been writing software for years, we write bad code from time to time. And so to be able to inspect, our code, figure out what it's doing, we use something called a debugger. And a debugger is usually a separate application that's able to run your code, right? Run your process, run your DLL, run your script, whatever it is, and allow you to step through what's going on. So what I want to emphasize, it's a separate program. And typically when you go to run a debugger, as you'll see here in this example, a debugger is meant to be able to actually, when one program runs by its name, automatically run your debugger. So I want to show what this would look like. Notice I have Notepad open. And for those that have been living under a rock, right? Notepad.exe, when I run it, it opens. All right, nothing crazy there. So if I was developing, Microsoft's Notepad application, and there was some type of bug, right? Maybe when I wanted to see the status bar down here didn't come up. What I could do is I could navigate, and you'll notice this is very similar to the same path we just saw. HKey local machine, software Microsoft, Windows NT current version, and then image file execution options. Notice that they actually name the key notepad.exe here. What I want to share is, on my case of this Windows 10 VM here, image file execution options already exist, and there's tons of applications that already are present. But not all of them, and if you notice, none of them ship with an option over here. This is called a value called debugger. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and create myself notepad.exe. And notice notepad.exe, by creating that, it does nothing. Notepad.exe will run just fine. It launches. But we mentioned it has a feature called a debugger. And if we create a string value over here and call it debugger, Microsoft has a cool technique under the hood, and it says if a debugger value exists with, once again, this is in HKey local machine. So as John mentioned earlier, a normal unprivileged user couldn't even write to this section of the registry. But if you did have these privileges, I could call this debugger and say I want a different application to automatically spawn. Somebody want to make up an application for me?
Calc.
Okay. The calculator, calc.exe. Yeah. So notice now that I've set this, no reboot needed or anything, and I want to run notepad.exe, notepad doesn't come up and calculator comes up. The reason for this is what's happening under the hood is when I go and notepad.exe actually gets run, the system says, oh, you want to run a debugger. So it puts a debugger in here first, and it says the debugger is called calc.exe and passes the argument notepad. Well, calc, for instance, does nothing with an argument. So it's like, I'm going to ignore this and another program runs. So I think for those that even have never heard of this technique knows where this is going real quick, right? So this is a great for process substitution. John, can you share a little bit about what you typically see on ThreadOps of how this technique is used in the wild, like daily?
Yeah, actually, if you can share the image I pasted into the thing, one of the malware families that we see all the time is called JRAT. It's a remote access tool written in Java. They wrote it specifically because Java doesn't get flagged, Java exe, and then there's just some random executable name that gets run afterward. The JRAT installer typically does this technique. Disables, it just spews forth everything and tries to disable everything that it possibly can.
Yep, I got it up right now.
This is one of our remediation instructions from a host that was infected with JRAT. And you can see that JRAT said, okay, I want to disable RawShark, which is a component of Wireshark. We've got in there the MBAM service, which is Malwarebytes, Viper, and Sunbelt AVs. It just tries to disable every possible executable that it knows about. And what it does is it creates these registry values with the debugger value set to service host. And when you run service host, svchost.exe by itself, it does nothing.
So I'm going to show that in action real quick, what John meant, just in case, it's sometimes nice to be able to watch this in action. So remember before Notepad would spawn calc? All right, congrats, it's great. The Notepad spawns calc. What John was mentioning, hackers have learned that SVC host, the legitimate application in Windows, keep in mind if we set this to SVC host, what this will now do is call svchost.exe, and the argument that it passes to it once again is Notepad. But when we go to run it this time, notice Notepad, SVC host is a hidden window. It doesn't come up. Its process spawns real quick, but we get absolutely nothing there. So I think this is maybe a good chance to take a look to see, does anybody have questions how this works? I see there's some Q&A because we're going to show a little bit more about how this is used and all kinds of other things that you could do.
Yep. We don't really have too many questions specifically about this. We have a question about crypto mining. So somebody wanted to know, is crypto mining still an issue for MSPs? Are we still seeing that? And if so, what are some of the signs that it's running? So I think probably John's probably best position to answer this.
Signs that it's running. Huntress doesn't see processes and monitor processes, so signs that are running are from what I've heard. But a lot of it is we'll get complaints about system resource usage fairly high or some strange network traffic.
Network traffic will be a big giveaway. If you were to compare ransomware and crypto mining, ransomware is going to be doing a lot of CPU usage and a lot of disk usage, but crypto mining is not writing anything to disk. So in that case, you're going to see CPU usage and a lot of network traffic where it's sending out all the stuff that it's done to get checked.
I'm trying to think. We haven't, the big ones we saw last year when the Kaseya vulnerability was used to push out Monero, but since then it's just been here and there, nothing major.
Yeah, I wanted to share, this is a blog by the Alien Vault team here real quick that's really timely. This is from last year, I recall, when crypto coin mining, right, when Bitcoin and all the currencies were at their all-time high. What do you know? It was much more popular.
Right.
When the currencies crashed, it went back to ransomware.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a huge difference, right? Like if Bitcoin is at $6,000 or $20,000, even a partial will make you a lot more money.
So let's go to, once again, back to the screen share here and show you what, the actual case. Once again, this was late 2018, about a year ago, right at the height of, I think if you take a look at Bitcoin pricing and things along those lines, where we were seeing a lot of these payloads that when they would infect, one of the first things they would do is drop a coin miner, right? Using your electricity and your CPU to gather coins. And if we take a look, I remember this one that noticed that Matto Miner, in addition to all the other nonsense that it dropped, right? Deleting host files, all kinds of things like that to prevent communication out or enable communication. One of the first things it did was with an IFEO debugger, it actually created the command that was run here as task kill. Works just like the SVC host example that we saw earlier. Prevents one application from running. So I think that's a great example of how to tie these things together is yes, we still see crypto coin miners, not as frequently. With that said, we see a lot of these mechanisms of, for instance, with the crypto coin miner, they don't want to be stopped. So they purposely try to disable either anti-tampering mechanisms or kill the entire antivirus by itself. And if I recall, going back to one of our oldest blogs that Huntress ever did, we used to do like more incident response as well while our product was coming up in early 2015. And if I can go search for this on the fly, this technique has been around so long. Like I said, I'm just pulling it out of here. Notice this was an MS SQL attack that was used here. But if we go take a look at what this MSP partner was looking at, here once again, image file execution options used to disable. And if you take a look, that's what, 360 Safe, which is a Chinese antivirus, AV Guard. We get further down, things along those lines. Kaspersky Antivirus, Komodo, Avira. Obviously
Google
a little
updater.
Yeah, all kinds of things that are in there that it's disabling. So image file execution options is super useful if you've never seen it before.
So Alex wanted to know, can we use arguments with the image file execution options? Can you pass arguments?
To it. It's going to be a specific order. So for instance, task kill /F, as you saw in that one example, it actually gets messed up. And I believe what it does is it does task kill, and then it passes the argument of, notepad.exe in this example, and then you get the /F. So there's little like awkward weirdisms there, but technically, your debugger, if you think about a debugger running, a debugger would need to get the arguments of that command. So for instance, if it was notepad.exe space file.txt, that would actually get passed into whatever the name of the debugger was, notepad, and then the arguments, which I've actually seen this used in real life where the actual malware getting spawned instead of the antivirus would then, would actually go and perform whatever action was supposed to be performed. Sometimes it'd even be like Microsoft Word, that they would only inject malware when Microsoft Word opened up, but then they'd take the arguments sent to it, parse them, and actually spawn Word so your file came open and it didn't interfere with anybody. Once again, this whole technique isn't even possible if you're not an administrative user. Reiterating that security boundary.
And I was just going to add, I've seen IFEO used with batch files. So if you wanted to have it run a batch file, and you could put your arguments in there.
All right. All right. Martin asked, does SVC host run elevated if a standard user launches it as a debugger?
No, it doesn't auto-elevate, thankfully. So no privilege escalation there. But sometimes you can actually find cases where, because of something's commonly named, you might be able to actually get something that's running as a service and use image file execution options, which remember, you got to have admin rights already. So not quite the same as privileged escalation, as opposed to more like indirect execution of a privileged process. So thankfully, SVC host runs as the user in this case. It's not getting like system privileges or something along those lines.
Are there any limitations to which applications you can run through IFEO?
I would say your mileage may vary. I actually had a huge amount of testing that I did, and I actually noticed some applications when run through image file executions, even though it didn't have a screen, it was windowless. All right, the window was hidden. When I ran it through SVC host, sometimes I get a flash, which is bad for hacker OPSEC, great for us as defenders. So let's be happy that that sometimes happens.
Right. Let's see. So Anonymous asked, on the earlier compromises you mentioned, was ConnectWise control actually vulnerable, or was it exploited after credentials were harvested?
No, we've never seen, as of yet, control or really any software. Kaseya several years ago had an actual vulnerability, but the control example earlier, just good old-fashioned, credential compromise. Users in the IT department, whether it was some other application, keystroke log, we don't know where the creds came from at the moment, but thank goodness it was just control being used as an application for nefarious purposes.
Right.
So one of the other things that people ask us from time to time is, well, Kyle, why don't you protect Huntress and prevent the application from, being disabled? And we mentioned earlier that that's stuff that we could improve, but there's way more attack surface than just the process. And one of them is manipulating the network traffic. And one of my funniest examples here is, what if you, what good is your cloud-based malware product if it can't talk to the cloud? Right? If you have the definitions from 6 weeks ago because somebody modified anything in your system to prevent you from going out to that website, what does that do? So I think one good way to actually show this is an old school feature. I don't know how many, typically Linux admins know a little bit more about the host file than on the Windows side of the house, but this is another one of those really exciting examples of how a privileged user could not or can do something that an admin user can't. So I'm going to bring up with some more screen sharing, but while I'm getting that set up, guys, you want to talk about the purpose of the host file back in the day?
Sure.
DNS resolving, how that worked?
Yeah.
I was going to say, it's old early like DARPANet. They were passing around a host file to each other.
Right.
So they, because there was no DNS, so the colleges would send around this host file, and if you weren't listed in the host file, people weren't going to find you.
Right. Yeah. So DNS, a domain name service, was created for the purpose of allowing you to not have to remember a bunch of IP addresses or pass around these host files. Right. So if I say Google.com, I can go out and I will get an IP address or a list of IP addresses where I can reach Google.com. Before that was created, like John was saying, there used to be a text file that would associate some name with an IP address, and so that way on the internet you could talk to all these different computers before we had DNS, and so it just kind of became to Unix and some of the early Linux stuff. When they built Windows, they added that in there as well, which a lot of people don't actually know exists, but it's the same format of the file. It's super basic. You can provide an IP address and a host name, and whenever your computer tries to look up that host name, it will first look in the host file, which is the interesting part. So if I go in there and I change Google to some IP address, instead of my computer going out to saying, hey, who's Google.com, it'll say, oh, it's in the host file. I already know who that is. Let me just go with what I know.
Okay, so I think you bought me enough time to at least get dangerous here and test this out on the fly. We'll see how the demo gods treat me real quick. So going back to some good old-fashioned screen sharing. So I'm back on that same Windows 10 VM running as a user with admin privileges. So all that I've set up while we were away and Chris and John were explaining that, I went to Microsoft.com, right? It's in my browser, great. Microsoft is resolving. I had to go and undo my image file execution option debugger. I couldn't figure out why it wasn't working. I couldn't open Notepad. It was calling SVC
Why
host.
is Notepad not running?
So, owned myself here.
Yeah.
But I've got Notepad running. Notice it's as an administrator. Because if I actually try to go into where it's actually located, I'm going to be able to see read-only access to this text file that is the host file, but I'm not going to have the ability to save it. Hence the reason that I spawned Notepad as an administrative process. So in case you haven't seen, it's under C, Windows, System32, drivers. Any Linux nerd would recognize etc. And if we say all files, you'll see it has a host file. It's been around forever in Windows. And notice it even gives you a quick example of like, make whatever domain you want to resolve to whatever IP. So if you could imagine shady hackers doing something shady, and I think actually, John, you provided some actual examples in the wild of how this was used, right?
I just put some generic ideas. We don't monitor the host file, so I haven't seen per se.
Yeah, give me 1 second here and I'll actually show some legit cases. So could you imagine if, for instance, we were so worried about what if they kill my process? Well, what if I let your process run, but you can't get out to updates.myantivirus.com
Yep.
or myrmm.com? You can quickly see how this has significant ramifications, both for your security and productivity.
So to take a step back there, what Kyle's showing here is he has taken the domain name updates.myantivirus.com and said, when you want to talk to this, you need to go to the IP address 127.0.0. If you're not familiar, 127.0.0.1 is called the local loopback address. It is reserved, and it means talk to the same computer. So in this case, he's telling the browser, hey, if you want to go find Microsoft, it's on this computer, which it's not, and so then it's not going to resolve.
Yep, so here's the live demo gods killing me real quick, just because I cached that lookup here earlier. Let's see if we can find a Microsoft.com. Once again, I've saved my host file. NSLOOKUP is still finding it back at the local domain and things along those lines. But the idea behind it, when this is working, and if I would have set up and not actually cache some of my entries, maybe I can make Disney.com or something silly like that. Keep in mind, the whole idea behind this is just preventing legitimate traffic from going to where it needs to go, or even in shadier cases, it could be redirecting that traffic to something else. That's why like security mechanisms like certificate pinning, that you don't just blindly trust you're going to a DNS name. You either want to pin it to, its SSL or TLS certificate, some type of fingerprint there that allows it to do its thing. I imagine if I give this VM a reboot, and maybe we'll actually do it, we could see this, demo go down. Let's see if I can actually get to my Disney.com, and I'm routing just fine here. So we'll give the VM a reboot before the end of this thing and make sure that the host file is actually referenced. But this is how it works, and this technique has been around forever to be able to minimize where you're going. But the reality is you don't even need to use some of these old school techniques. Sometimes you can get away with built-in operating system features, and I don't mean like the host file, even though that is a built-in operating system feature. One of the best things of research at Black Hat Europe 2017 came from IBM, right? Their team that focuses on offensive security. Notice they released a whole thing here on evading, bypassing, and disabling Microsoft's new advanced threat protection product. And they ran a number on this brand new product. And some of the stuff that they actually did here is they start talking about why they went after this new attack surface, what they were going to prevent, right? How could they evade some of this new product, all the different versions and updates that were coming out to it. And the real juicy stuff is further below. So notice the first thing they talk about is how do I get a foothold in the network? And they talk about how do they gain access and maintain long-term access. But the next question is, once I'm in that network, what do I do? And so, they start talking about, I'm now in this situation where Windows, starting with 17.03, now it's 19.03 is the most newest version of Windows 10. There's all kinds of these great new features for blocking PowerShell and things of that nature. But notice some of their best things, despite all these great artificial intelligence or machine learning based tactics and techniques, their new Defender ATP has all kinds of new capabilities saying, I'm finding process injections, privilege escalations, process hollowing. It's got all kinds of crazy new features that the original Defender didn't have that obviously make it harder for somebody to get a foothold. Now, this whole thing is about, well, we're post-breach. We've already got access, right? And if your users post-breach have admin access, that enables this attacker to do some crazy dangerous things. So for instance, as you're doing reconnaissance, you have different ways to do reconnaissance. And I'm going to go straight into that case that we talked about earlier before, which was the host file in places. Notice they actually said taming the beast here, trying to be able to beat this new antivirus capability. So they start looking, can I kill it? That's things that we were already doing, right? Talking about image file execution options as well. But they ran into some issues where some of the processes within, Anti-Malware Defender was actually a new Windows 10, what they call a protected process, meaning that they actually do some additional stopping. But notice the cat and mouse game that we talked about before. It's always this case of what can I do to get around your new defense? So for instance, they used the ability that Project Zero announced that there's an actual way to use, if you're an admin user. For those that aren't familiar, this is the Service Control Manager, SC, and they found a way that they could reconfigure Trusted Installer and be able to tell it, run command.exe and stop Windows Defender and delete Windows Defender and then restart Trusted Installer to do this as a bypass to disable the protected process. Needless to say, that's a thing that you as an unprivileged user could not do. So that's a great example of that attack surface. Keep going on here. This is a great statement by one of my favorite researchers, Matt Graber. He came out and said, look, in the assumed breach world we now live in, how could you possibly, say it doesn't matter, you're already admin? The reality is, as an administrator, you should do whatever you can to prevent yourself from getting to that security layer, but you should also be willing to go toe-to-toe with what this takes. And notice that they actually came out and said, look, ATP, not only did we try to find ways to get around in case they found a way to block us from disabling ATP from that Service Control Manager, they found new ways to be able to say, you know what? I can do this similar type technique and disable like the diagnostics tool. So anybody who's not familiar with this service, the Diagtrack service is the telemetry service that sends all kinds of stuff back into, Windows Defender's cloud or ATP's cloud. It's very similar to the technique we did with the host file, which was, I'm not going to let you get traffic out to the internet. Not the same thing, but a different approach to accomplish the same goal. And it goes on, right? In regards to hijacking DLLs, there's all kinds of these techniques on how to be able to remove, privileged process light protections, killing processes. Notice more task kill getting denied or enabled. In this case, they actually showed that the new techniques to be able to pull a password out of memory or pull a hash out of memory with Mimikatz was now blocked. But once again, if you come through here and actually change the service name, you can now get this payload to run. So once again, cat and mouse game. That's a lot of words I just threw out of them.
That
things
was pretty,
like that.
pretty technical there.
So let's take a step back and talk a little bit of then, how does this relate to the security boundary? And what did we actually do as a fundamental thing that we wouldn't have been able to do as a non-admin user? So for instance, I've got a slide open right now that's about how we were able to disable or manipulate the trusted installer service. Want to talk a little bit about the service, what you usually need for privileges?
So one of the things that attackers are going to be looking for is misconfigured services, right? So in this case, a service could be run by a lower, or it could be modified and started by a lower privileged user, but the service is going to start as system. Okay, so instead of being started as the user or even as admin, it's going to be started as NT authority system, which gives you a bunch of extra privileges, which is generally meant only for system level processes. And in this case, they were able to modify the command to execute something else and then start the service. So even though they couldn't change the trusted installer executable, they said, oh, hey, when you start trusted installer, don't run trustedinstaller.exe. Instead, run this other thing over here, and now they can use that to make changes. Like you can see, Kyle was showing that they, used that to stop the Windows Defender service. They ran command.exe, they ran the sc command, which is the service controller, and they used that to stop Windows Defender, right? Because you couldn't stop that as a regular user, but hey, as system, you can do whatever you want.
So another example they provided of a similar technique was they actually talked about these tampering mechanisms, and they gave a PowerShell example, that I just had open here that I got to track down, that was setting a debug privilege. So one of those things, for instance, NT token privilege here, SE debug privilege, that can't happen as a low integrity user. So that's a great example of what you really did is you neutered their ability to set the debug privilege. And since they can't set the debug privilege, they can't manipulate the trusted installer service that runs the system that allows them to be able to disable the antivirus. So it's once again attack surface all the way down. I see we're going along in the tooth. Yep. We're about 1 hour in.
A little bit over.
I've got one more technique I want to show, but I think it's equally important for some Q&A. So let's stop some sharing real quick. Take some Q&A, and I'll set up the very last technique that a lot of people don't know that you could do as a privileged user.
So Jason asked, would setting UAC to prompt for credentials on a secure desktop or any elevated task be beneficial, or would these attacks slip by UAC?
So the answer is UAC, as a user that is in a medium integrity, that means they're an admin, but they haven't right-clicked and said run as administrator. In that circumstance, there's tons of bypasses for UAC, and even though Microsoft has officially declared UAC is not a security boundary, they're still servicing some of these bypasses because they really do work as like a building block to enable attacks. Yeah. So as a medium integrity user trying to get to high integrity, I can't think of one time in 10 years that UAC, since Windows Vista, I haven't been able to get from medium to high integrity. But as a low integrity user, that's privilege escalation. Yeah. And that's much harder. Much harder.
Yeah, so it's what Microsoft means by security boundary is it used to be a little more loosely defined. When it initially came out, it kind of meant like any security feature whatsoever. And then they kind of backpedaled from that a little bit when a lot of people started publishing these UAC bypasses, and they're saying, hey, look, we can get around this UAC security feature by doing this or by doing that, or all these things that Microsoft didn't expect. And so Microsoft said, hey, you know what? This isn't a security boundary anymore. And really what it appears that they consider a security boundary and not a security boundary is something they consider pretty perfect, right? Would you agree with that? Like, if there's no real way around it other than some really crazy exploitation or something, then they'll say, yes, this is a security boundary. If it's just another thing that kind of gets in your way, makes the attacker have to work a little bit harder, but can be bypassed, they generally don't call those security boundaries.
Privacy. I'm getting ready to show a capability which involves hijacking sessions. But we didn't talk really about, at the end of the day, when you're giving your users access as administrators for whatever line of business application that you have to have, I get it, I've heard the stories, you're really violating the privacy on those boxes. If you think about a user on a shared host, like maybe a terminal services server, or just even like a shared workstation in a lobby, a kiosk or something, if they have admin rights, I mean, John, is there anything that prevents them from taking ownership to files?
No. They can go in, they can navigate through anybody's folders, they'll be prompted that you can have access.
So that's one way of privacy, but sometimes it's a little bit more shocking. So Chris, I'm rebooting the VM, that way I can show some of the techniques, and I'm logging in some multiple users to simulate. Do you want to talk a little bit about, and John, I know you know a lot about the old Citrix under the hood of RDP, but you want to talk a little bit how sessions work, things along those lines in Windows, multiple users logged in at the same time, things like that?
I'm sorry, me or Chris? You said Chris, then you said John.
John, take it away. You've been pretty quiet over there.
I'm trying to remember the Citrix stuff. So yeah, Citrix, what is it? NT four. The original version of Terminal Services was co-developed by Citrix, and they had a license on being able to develop even through up till 2000, and then somehow they ended up splitting, and that's where remote desktop services came about. And so instead of buying Citrix licenses, you could just use the built-in functionality into Windows, and they started adding more and more. I think somebody even mentioned in the questions the remote desktop broker, which I believe was originally a Citrix thing, and original MetaFrame XP back in the day.
So where we're going is the ultimate idea, just for everybody who's ever used a terminal services server, is concurrent users, right? That's usually your server variants have a license that allows you to have a concurrent user, one user logged on while the other user is. But I bet you haven't really thought about how that security boundary works versus a privileged user and an unprivileged user. And that's one of those like small things that we totally take for granted that can really be abused to wreak havoc on end users, and especially violate privacy. And even in some places, compliance could be one of those things that users are supposed to be protected, that could even open you up to lawsuits and the extreme. So what I'm doing is real quick, I'm logging in as an admin user, and you guys can watch me set this whole thing up. It's not going to make a difference. So I'm back again on my Windows 10 VM. And notice I'm in an admin command prompt here, running as my user. And if I take a look here, who am I? I'm running as a user here named Paul, right? Just made up user. And if we go, I'm going to lock this workstation. And I'm going to log in real quick as another account that I just created while we were waiting for the computer to reboot. We notice here on this machine, this is not on a domain, but I have a separate user here named Darlene, right? So just a made up example of kiosk machine in your work center where you're just sharing assets, right? You've got hot desks that people lock and log in and out of and things along those lines. And so all I'm doing while we wait for Darlene's profile to load is I'm going to show you Darlene's user has no administrative privileges, right? But the idea behind this is she has her right to privacy, right? Maybe she has her email open like Outlook or O365 Online, G Suite, whatever she's doing. That's the first thing I'm going to do is open up some of her applications to demonstrate what she could be in. So as I go through here, All right, my Chrome browser launches. We're gonna wait for it to launch, maybe. This is live demonstrations to a T, right? I almost said login instead of login. That's clearly the indicator we're getting close to the end of the episode here. And so I just log into office.com, theoretically using Darlene's username and password. But I'll leave it here as Office. We can imagine this is an authenticated session that she's logged into.
Right. Don't get too hung up on whether it's Office or whatever, right? It's just that she has some windows open on her computer with her stuff going.
Okay. So I'm going to, within this VM, I'm going to lock her account. And I'm going to go back to Paul real quick. And a lot of people forget that Paul, as an admin user, has the ability to do a lot of shady things as what we call the system user. So that might be one of those things that a lot of us aren't familiar with, the concept of the difference between what can an administrator do and what can a system user do. So I'm going to go ahead and sign in as Paul. You know, great security here. Paul doesn't even have a password.
Oh, man.
All right. Paul's really winging it. So we're going to say top notch.
Local admin and no password.
Yep.
Okay.
So, well, I'm getting ready to talk, gents, since we're waiting, on the VM back and forth.
There we go.
It's important to see here, Paul is an admin user. And he can do things like, for instance, he could query a user or the users. And he could see, look, not only is Paul connected to a console and it's active, but he could see Darlene has also a session, but it's disconnected in this state. And if we take a real quick look at who am I and take a look at the privileges that Paul has, he has a boatload of privileges. But notice some of these privileges like SE debug are disabled and things along those lines that he can't do even though he's running from an administrator console. So for instance, if he was to abuse the built-in terminal services connection manager, he could say, you know what? I know Darlene is logged into this computer and she's on console number 2 and it's disconnected. But when we try to log in here, we notice that it says username or password is incorrect. And for those that have never seen this before, there's a GUI equivalent of this as well from the task manager that you could go through here and say, you know what? I want to try to log into Darlene's session because I'm an admin, right? An admin should have all the privileges in the world. So we're used to thinking that just because when I connect here and it gives me access to the password, well, Paul doesn't know Darlene's password, right? It gives us a false sense of security, like we mentioned earlier, that this is satisfactory.
Right.
But the reality is Paul is only running as his high integrity privileged user. There is this concept of system. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go download, one of the easiest tools to be able to get system rights is a process that we as IT, departments, MSPs, we tend to use PSExec for remotely executing things. It's also really good for opening a command shell as system. So I'm going to go on the fly, sysinternals.com. I'm going to download this legitimate Microsoft signed application, PSExec, and I'm going to do nothing nefarious with it. I'm just going to show as Paul. We'll make this nice and easy here. I'm going to bring PSExec onto my desktop. I'm going to CD to, not that file, to his user profile, get to his desktop so we don't have to worry about any of those relative path issues. And I'm going to say, hey, PSExec, run me as system. Give me an interactive window, which means like let me interact with it, click, type, etc. And run me command.exe. We're going to get an end user license agreement that's going to come up. We're going to agree to it. But notice I now have what appears to be an administrator console. But the difference is when I type in who am I this go around, I'm now NT authority system, which if I do another who am I /priv, I have different privileges enabled for me. So it's a little bit janky, a little bit busted here, but you can see I have slightly different privileges than what it looked like for Paul's example earlier, and it won't even let me scroll back to see those. That's just how janky this is getting. But if we take a look, backup debug, notice this time SE debug is enabled, which is kind of like the king of permissions. So once again, this is just Paul. He's going to be able to say, query the users that are logged in. We once again see Darlene is active. And now we can do things like tscon. Let me log in as Darlene. Sure, why not? And since this is the same broker under the hood that handles all terminal services, consoles, and sessions, we would be, as Paul, running everything that's open within Darlene's context. Sending emails as her. Say, for instance, if she had LastPass or some type of two-factor authentication. This is why it's so critical to separate admin boundaries. Because even though as a high-integrity user, he couldn't do a lot of these nefarious things, John said it elegantly earlier. The system can't protect itself against the system, right? It's just a hard thing at the end of the day. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try, but I hope this is really eye-opening of something that you can do. And maybe one last thing for somebody that wants to do this, maybe in your own demo, show your boss what you learned. I'm going to lock Darlene's session again. I'm going to go ahead and log in as Paul. And if you want to do it without all those fancy commands and you want to show them just from like a GUI version, notice I'm still running a system. If I open up the task manager this time with the GUI, and I say, users, I can now actually use the GUI this time and say connect as Darlene as well. Two of the same exact pieces of functionality, two different ways to get it. So I hope that's eye-opening. I hope that really reiterates to everybody why, oh why, you need to separate your user privileges. And really, only at the most extreme circumstances should you allow users to run as an administrator in your workstations. So with that said, I see that John has dumped some of the links to that session hijacking in here. We'll obviously put a link in the description. I think this is a good time to say, you know what? This really does, for the purpose of this, concludes the content we're going to share in this episode of Tradecraft Tuesday. With that said, we always stay for Q&A. That's where our audience learns the most. So fire away. We've got some questions here we can answer, and then we'll wrap up the episode after that.
Okay. So we got one from John. He asked if wildcards could be used in the host file to effectively redirect everything to 127.0.0.1. Unfortunately, no.
Yeah.
You can't.
Yeah, that's one.
It's a direct match. It's which actually makes it kind of annoying, is that you can't forward some subdomains and not others. So it's a direct match. No wildcard matching is available.
And I think that's someone who pointed out that's why Kyle's example of Disney.com didn't work, because it was redirecting to www.disney.com.
Oh, was that actually it?
You did .disney.com only.
Oh, instead of the subdomain.
Yeah, you have to be explicit about
Let's
the
answer that one.
So it's becoming best practice to not run users as local admins. Just such a hassle to support. Adam, I get it, brother. At the end of the day, I 100% get like the boundary to enforce people as administrators is hard, especially with old applications. I appreciate you asking that question. I think it's way too easy that from the top of everybody's hill to say, I would never give somebody admin privileges. With that said, I can't think of, Chris, during your time as red team or even our time as offensive security, I mean, we always found a user that was running as admin, always the exception. Yeah. And it could have even just been like that user was going somewhere remote with no internet access and they needed to be able to install their own applications. With that said, there are a lot of applications out there that are trying to fill this gap that, kind of UAC doesn't provide completely, which is how do I allow certain applications or certain processes to run as a admin or system without giving that user the end-all be-all admin privileges. We mentioned auto elevate before. John, you mentioned something else I couldn't remember in the enterprise space. Do you remember what the name is? And I hate to put you on the spot that way because I don't.
No, I don't remember.
But there's a couple of these applications for some of these.
It'll temporarily give you admin access if you request it. It's like a token, a one-time token to be admin to do what you need to do. And I was going to say, even like some newer applications they install to the user's profile now. I mean, problem, like when Microsoft changed, when they switched when XP became the norm, everybody was used to running on Windows 98 where everybody essentially had admin privs. And so they came up with the power users group, where you had some limited capabilities. You could install applications, but there were system specific things that you could not do. And it seems that Microsoft kind of got away from that, but not everybody's applications have caught up.
Right.
It's been 20 years, so
It's pretty hard to get granular with the permissions. Like John was saying, is like it's hard to say like, well, you can do these specific things, but not these. Which means it's also hard to say like, hey, you can run this application, but not that one, and this one is admin, and this one not. It's I don't know. It's hard. I don't know how else better to say it. I mean, there are some other tools like we talked about before, Auto Elevate, that will allow your low privileged users to temporarily get additional privileges, so that they can do something, and you can approve that and manage that centrally. So there's things like that, but it's not an easy thing. But again, if your users are admin, somebody said, hey, just treat them like they're adults, but adults still make mistakes. Adults still open emails with ransomware. Those kind of things happen. So just try to get the least privileges that you can. I mean, most of these people, like we were saying, they're not nefarious, right? Like your users aren't intending to delete stuff and do bad things. They just don't know better.
Yep, I agree. They don't know better. What other good questions do we have floating in here? And it looks like we have a handful. Do you have any recommended best practice for 2FA, MFA? Internally, we handle credentials with two different approaches. The first one is going to be password manager, ensuring that everybody has every random credential. When we can't use single sign-on, we try to use single sign-on everywhere, whether it's Google Authenticator or Google Login or SSO provided by Azure, whatever those is. We try to kill passwords, period. Right. If the application requires a password, everything goes into LastPass. That way we can, as a high level, do queries against the passwords without actually seeing the passwords to see if there's duplicates. That way preventing password reuse. At the end of the day, we don't believe that that's a perfect strategy, so we use two-factor. And we use Duo internally. We use Duo on our application. We're pretty happy with Duo's opportunity. And I think for managed service providers, there's like licenses available. IT departments as well. There might be something allowing you to use it internal. But really reach out to those teams to ask. With that said, there's others. There's plenty of others.
It's a struggle. I mean, for us, one of the things that we're always looking at is like, okay, we've got accounts at all kinds of different third-party services that we use. Either for social media or running our systems or things like CRM, all those kind of things, right? And what we tell all of our users is, like Kyle said, use LastPass, generate a unique password for every single application that you're going to use, and enable two-factor. But how do we as a company go around and ensure that everybody has two-factor on every system, right? I'd have to go log into 40 different places and remember all of them and make sure and nag people. It's easier if you just have single sign-on, right? Like if you can push everything through a single sign-on, make sure that single sign-on has two-factor enabled and everybody has to have two-factor turned on there, then you can kind of limit the scope of all of the things that you might be concerned about, whether or not they have two-factor or not. On the downside, now you have one login kind of for everything, so there's no great solution. It's a hard problem.
Yeah, definitely hard. Great project-based work, obviously, to be able to sell. And we're huge. These examples, for instance, all the stuff we brought to you in this episode of Tradecraft Tuesday, these are great ways that when you're getting together with your, maybe you're getting together with your CISO, or you're the CISO briefing the board, or you're the MSP doing your monthly or quarterly business review. These are the type of things that you could show them and not tell them. Why do you need this? And obviously, if you're, all-in services and you just say you get it or you don't, that's a little bit easier. But sometimes you got to be able to justify what you're using. And I'm a big fan of show them, not tell them. So I hope that some of these Tradecraft is useful for you to be able to justify why you need to minimize that admin privileges.
Let's see. Any other questions here?
Somebody mentioned a scenario earlier I liked, actually Edward, and I think I recognize this Edward, which, by the way, brother, I appreciate your help previously on some of these incidents. He mentions nobody in his environment is given admin privileges, whether it be network-based or local or even as an administrator. I don't log on as an admin unless I must, and even if I do, I limit my logon time and only perform a task as needed. That is a great example of minimizing privileges. I can tell you firsthand, me as an attacker used to bother users, slow down their machine long enough to force a remote connection, because then your token is in memory. And if I have privileges, I can impersonate your token to do other things, like to spread laterally and things along those lines. So that's one of those dangerous pieces that I might only be a local admin, but you log in with domain admin privileges, and now I can start impersonating your token, or I can convince you to go into an SMB share and harvest your actual hash from there and do like a pass the hash technique. So huge kudos to you, Edward, for being able to run an environment like that. We typically don't see admins that are so defensive of their credentials. Even in some of the older Windows 7 systems that we've talked about this before on the show, that if you leave that user, and they log out on Windows 7, that password is still in clear text in memory that an admin user can pull down in clear text using the Mimikatz technique. So that's probably another show, even though it's a widely known technique. Maybe that's another topic for next month. With that said, we've got a handful of questions still, but we've already gone. We're almost 90 minutes into this.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of them. Some of them don't quite relate to what we're talking about here today, but maybe we'll get to them in the future.
You've got an idea for next month or future months. That's where these topics come from, is from our user base. Once again, tell your friends about Tradecraft Tuesday. Obviously, this is a no-pitch, education-based seminar. We're going to continue doing it. I hope audio sounded slightly better this month for everybody. The studio is coming along for us as we grow. And maybe the last thing I mentioned is just a good old-fashioned, thank you for your questions. Thank you for your time. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for showing up.
Okay.
Until next time.
This concludes our September 2019 Tradecraft Tuesday.
Yeah. Stay safe out there.
Have a good one.